Hello, my name is Fabian Soto, and I am an assistant professor and head of the Computational Cognitive Neuroscience Lab at FIU in Miami, Florida. This is a pre-recorded presentation for the 2020 meeting of the Society of Mathematical Psychology. The title of this talk is An Observer Model Version of General Recognition Theory. Many important questions in vision are related to whether the representation of one stimulus property, such as shape, is invariant to changes in other properties, such as viewpoint. Conversely, other questions are related to whether representation of two stimulus properties is configural or holistic, so that one is encoded differently in the presence and absence of the other. How can we formally define invariant and configural representation and develop valid ways of testing for them? One framework that has been proposed to answer this question is General Recognition Theory, or GRT. GRT is a multidimensional extension of signal detection theory. Because of this, it offers the advantage of dissociating perceptual versus decisional effects in the study of invariance and configurality. GRT inherits assumptions from signal detection theory, like the assumptions that there is variability in the perceptual effect of a single stimulus. For example, imagine that you repeatedly present this face of a female with a fearful expression to a participant. Let's suppose that the x-axis here represents emotional expression, with neutral at the left and fearful at the right, and the y-axis represents sex, with one end representing male and the other end representing female. Each dot represents the combined effect of the stimulus in the two-dimensional space of face emotion and sex, which can be summarized by a bivariate Gaussian distribution. The univariate Gaussians next to each dimension are a summary of the perceptual representation of that dimension for this specific stimulus. The ellipse represents the joint perceptual representation of both dimensions for this stimulus, and as you can see, it takes the shape of the cloud of points. Other faces, showing a female with a neutral expression, a male with a fearful expression, and a male with a neutral expression, are represented similarly. Perceptual separability is a property of these representations that can be defined informally within GRT. Perceptual separability of emotion from sex holds if the marginal distribution of a given emotion does not change with levels of sex. For example, here male and female faces look equally fearful. Perceptual separability of emotion from sex will fail if the marginals were different. In this example, female faces look more fearful than male faces. There are other forms of dimensional interaction defined within GRT, but due to time limitations we will focus on perceptual separability, which corresponds to what experimentalists usually have in mind when discussing invariance, in which a representation of a stimulus property does not change across changes in an irrelevant stimulus property. On the other hand, configural or holistic encoding corresponds to a violation of perceptual separability, in which the representation of a stimulus property changes with changes in a second stimulus property, being context-specific. GRT has been extremely useful to study invariance and configurality of visual representations, but it also has some shortcomings. First, GRT reduces the representation of a dimension to a single variable, providing insight on whether two dimensions interact, but not how two dimensions interact. Second, GRT has been criticized by the arbitrariness of the dimensional space in which the model is presented. Observer models from psychophysics extend signal detection theory and provide a richer perceptual representation of stimuli. Such models are widely used in psychophysics, but to this date they have not been used to study problems of dimensional interactions through links with multidimensional signal detection theory. The present project had the goal of providing such theoretical links by proposing an observer model version of GRT. We use as a starting point what is perhaps the simplest and most widely used observer model in psychophysics, the Linear-Nonlinear observer model. This model assumes that the observer takes an incoming stimulus and compares it against an internal representation via template matching, implemented via a dot product of the vector of pixel values in the incoming image and the vector of weights from an internal perceptual template. Internal noise is added to the obtained value, resulting in a random variable, representing the perceptual evidence that the feature encoded by the template is present in the stimulus. This perceptual evidence is compared against our threshold to obtain a final response that classifies the stimulus as matching or not matching the property represented by the template. Note how this last part of the model is essentially the same as signal detection theory, which allows us to straightforwardly relate GRT to this model. Importantly, the template in the linear-nonlinear observer model can be estimated using classification image techniques, also known as reverse correlation. This means that we have experimental access to a richer representation of stimulus properties than that offered by GRT. Besides pixel values, the model can be developed using any multidimensional space in which the stimuli can be described. The model is easy to understand, as the dot product has an intuitive geometrical interpretation involving an orthogonal projection of an input stimulus onto the template vector. Let's say that we have two templates, each one of them encoding one stimulus dimension. For example, template 1 in this figure could extract information about emotional expression from a face, whereas template 2 could extract information about identity. We can take stimuli presented in the pixel space, project them to these templates through a dot product, add Gaussian noise, and then describe the stimuli as the distribution of the resulting decision variables in this template space, which corresponds to a GRT model. Usually we will need at least one template per level to represent a given dimension. We can also define a form of invariance of templates in this framework, which we will call template separability. Template separability holds when the template used to obtain evidence about a property does not change with changes in another irrelevant property. Here in the left, the same template is used to determine, for example, face emotion, regardless of whether that face is male or female. On the other hand, at the right we have a case in which two templates are used to determine face emotion, a template for males and a second template for females. An important theoretical question is then how template separability is related to perceptual separability. That is, whether knowing one form of invariance tells us anything about the other. As it turns out, the presence or absence of template separability does not determine whether or not perceptual separability is observed. Let's first focus on the simpler case when template separability holds, so that the template used to extract information about a dimensional property is the same across levels of an irrelevant dimension. As shown in this figure, when template separability holds and there is a single template, perceptual separability can hold. For example, imagine that this is a template that extracts emotional expression from faces. S1 and S2 represent two stimuli that show the same emotion, but they differ in an irrelevant dimension. For example, S1 may be a male and S2 a female. It can be shown that if the vector connecting S1 to S2 is orthogonal to the template, then one obtains perceptual separability. However, this is a special case, as many other positions of S1 and S2 will produce a failure of perceptual separability even when template separability holds. In the example shown at the right, the male face or S1 would produce a stronger evidence of expression than the female face or S2. Note how here the angle between the segment connecting the two stimuli and the template is not 90 degrees. The magnitude of the violation of perceptual separability depends on this angle, as shown in the following figure. This figure shows in the x-axis the deviation of the angle from 90 degrees, and in the y-axis it shows the magnitude of deviations of perceptual separability in units of d'. The red and green curves simply represent different trajectories in the stimulus space going from complete orthogonality to complete lack of orthogonality. The take-home message is that in a model with an invariant visual representation at the level of the templates, it is possible to observe a lack of invariance at the level of perceptual dimensions, and that depends on stimulus properties. Let's now move to the case in which template separability fails. As shown in this figure, in this case perceptual separability can hold. Here, the template used to obtain evidence of expression in male faces represented by T1 is different from the template used to obtain evidence of expression in female faces represented by T2. A male face represented by S1 is projected to the male template T1, and a female face represented by S2 is projected to a female template T2. As seen here, it is still possible that the perceptual evidence for expression is the same after these operations. This will produce a GRT model with perceptual separability or invariance. Actually, the clarity of this example is obscuring how easy it is to obtain this result. In reality, S1 and S2 could be anywhere, and one could obtain perceptual separability by simply modifying the length of the two template vectors. Finally, when template separability fails, perceptual separability can also fail. This is observed in this last example, in which two stimuli produce different values of evidence when projected to their corresponding templates of equal length. These theoretical relations may appear to be rather esoteric, but they do have important consequences for the interpretation of research on invariance or separability and configurality. In the rest of this talk, we will cover some examples of such applications. First, this framework can explain a rather puzzling finding in the previous literature on separability of orientation and size. In 1991, Ashby and Lee reported the results of a study in which people were trained to identify stimuli that varied in size of a semicircle and orientation of its radius. Participants were asked to identify each of the stimuli shown in this image, and the responses were used to fit a GRT model. This figure reproduced the results found for one of the participants in the study, which are representative of other participants. Orientation was not separable from size, but rather it seems like larger stimuli looked more tilted to people. On the other hand, there was perceptual separability of size from orientation. This asymmetric pattern is puzzling because size and orientation are considered to be completely separable dimensions. A very simple observer model can explain the qualitative pattern of results without any free parameters. The templates used to detect different levels of each dimension are shown on the sides of the figure. Note that template separability holds in this model. The key assumption is that the template's extracting orientation must be at least as large as the largest stimulus. When that happens, the longer the line in the stimulus, the more evidence exists for a particular template, and we get this result, which is a violation of perceptual separability of orientation, with perceptual separability holding for size. A second application is related to the study of separability of phase dimensions. Previous studies have found violations of perceptual separability between phase, emotion, and identity using model-based analysis with GRT. From the point of view of the theory presented here, such violations could be due to the stimuli presented to participants rather than to the representation used by observers to extract information about phase expression and identity. We estimated templates for phase expression and identity using an ideal observer model trained with a large phase database. This results in a model that is optimal for each task and in which template separability holds. Then, we took 4 stimuli using a study by Soto and colleagues in 2015 and entered them as input to the resulting observer models. For simplicity, all variances were fixed to the same value of 1. This resulted in the GRT model shown in the right. The details of the model are not important as they don't match the observed results. More importantly, the simulation shows strong deviations from perceptual separability in both dimensions that are completely due to the experimental stimuli presented to the model, as the model had invariant templates built into it. The conclusion is clear. It is extremely easy to obtain violations of perceptual separability even when separability holds in the underlying visual representations. An important drawback of this simulation is that people might use templates that are not described in the simple space of image pixels, but in a complex multidimensional phase shape space as proposed by models of face recognition. In spite of that, the take-home message is that new studies need to be more rigorous regarding stimulus control when studying perceptual interactions, and take measures to avoid placing interactions in the stimuli themselves. A third application has to do with separability or invariance learning. Previous research shows that categorization training increases the separability of category-relevant phase dimensions. We know that, in theory, perceptual separability could be obtained by keeping non-separable templates and having each template adapt to its own stimulus by trivially scaling evidence through the template's length. True invariance learning would involve templates becoming more similar. Interestingly, this is exactly what we found in a recent study, in which we estimated classification images before and after categorization training, and found that the observed increments in perceptual separability are accompanied by increments in similarity of the underlying templates rather than more trivial forms of learning. In conclusion, in this project we have developed an observer model version of general recognition theory. This theoretical development solves 2 important problems with traditional GRT models. First, it embeds GRT representations within a higher dimensional stimulus representation so that GRT dimensions are non-arbitrary. Second, it allows to study richer representations that can be estimated experimentally through classification image techniques. Our theoretical results highlight that some cases of invariant or configural encoding might be due to stimulus properties, as in the case of failure of perceptual separability of orientation from size, and in the case of face identity and expression. They also indicate that separability or invariance learning could be due to adaptive changes in non-invariant representations, underscoring the importance of research seeking to understand not only whether separability changes depending on some experimental factor, but also how such changes occur. Thank you for your attention.